conference, and so we thought we'd put her back in this year. We're very pleased to have her. Dr. Ketchley is a lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington. Her current research and teaching interests include the history of the Golden Age Egyptology at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. She will be talking about the Emma Andrews project that she's been engaged with today. And so please welcome Dr. Sarah Ketchley.
Thank you, Tom, very much. So thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. And I'm looking forward to telling you more about the DH research and project work that I've been doing at the University of Washington for the past 9 or 10 years now. I trained as an Egyptologist in the UK, and my research interests currently focus on Nile travel and excavation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of Egyptian archaeology. I work mostly with primary source diaries, letters, and other printed handwritten material from this period. And I'll be showing you some of this material today. So I'll start by giving you a bit of historical background about Emma Andrews of our diary project fame, because I'd say there's a fair chance you'd never heard of her before today. Her travel journal record is significant for a number of reasons, not least because it provides detailed cultural and social histories of contemporary Egypt. For Egyptologists, it's an important record of her partner Theodore Davis's excavations in the Valley of the Kings, and a record of art and antiquities purchases and other contemporary archaeology in Egypt. We've added new material related to Emma's diary to our digital archive since our work began, and I'll be talking a bit about the range of material that we work with. And our ongoing transcription and encoding work led us to establish a publishing house called Newbook Digital Texts, and to offer undergraduate student internships in Digital Humanities. I'll give you an overview of this program and our digital research output, which includes maps, data visualizations, and digital tools for markup in XML TEI. And then finally, I'll finish up by showing you how I use the internship program to develop an introductory course in Digital Humanities at the University of Washington, which I've taught 5 times now over the past 4 years or so. So Emma Buttles Andrews was something of a unique woman for the period that she lived in. She was independently wealthy, she was very opinionated, and something of a force of nature, which really comes through in reading her diaries. She was the youngest daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Columbus, Ohio, Joel Buttles, who died when she was 13, leaving her to be raised by her mother and other relatives. And she married a lawyer called Abner Andrews in 1859, and he was the son of the president of the State Bank of Ohio. At some point in their marriage, Abner became an invalid, and Emma cared for him for a decade or more. And her father-in-law made a very generous provision for her in his will because of this, and so she was certainly very financially secure from an early age. The turning point of her life came when she met Theodore Davis in 1860, when he stopped to visit the Buttles family with his new bride Annie, and Annie was a cousin of Emma's. Theodore went on to stop in Columbus every year after that until Emma finally moved in with him when she was in her 50s. Davis was a lawyer to the so-called robber barons of New York, and he made a large fortune in a series of very shady banking deals before retiring in his late 40s to a mansion that he had built in Newport, Rhode Island, called the Reef. Emma and Annie also moved in with him at the same time, and their living arrangements, as you can imagine, were somewhat scandalous to Victorian society. And it seems that Annie's meek personality was very much overshadowed by her husband's and by Emma's. Following a bout of pneumonia, doctors recommended that Davis spend winters in a warmer climate, and he was only too happy to oblige. And so the annual trips along the Nile began, and they lasted for 2 decades, from 1889 onwards. And he and Emma threw their energies into collecting art and antiquities. Emma records some of Davis's first purchases of these antiquities, such as these mummy masks, which he bought in January 1890 from a Luxor antiquities dealer called Mohammed Mohasib. And both of the masks are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After a few years of tourism, the couple's interest turned to archaeology, and they both provided generous financial support to a number of Egyptologists working around Luxor at the time. And Theodore was finally granted the coveted concession to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. And his first solo excavation happened in 1902 with Howard Carter as his frontman. And you've probably heard of Carter as the discoverer of the tomb of Tutankhamun. His first discovery was this tomb of the nobleman Usahat. And this photograph was found between the pages of Emma's niece's diary, Nettie Buttles, and the diary is currently at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. You can see Nettie sitting down with Theodore standing behind her. And shortly after this photo was taken, unfortunately, this wooden mask disintegrated, fell apart. Prior to his death in 1915, Davis discovered 18 of the 42 royal tombs now known in the Valley of the Kings, including the tomb of Pharaoh Amenhotep III's in-laws, the tomb of Yuya and Tuyu, which until the discovery of Tutankhamun was the best preserved tomb found in Egypt. As well as the somewhat contentious tomb labelled as KV55, which is thought to be the final resting place of the so-called heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Emma's diary is important because it provides an eyewitness account of many of these excavations, with details that are often lacking in published tomb reports. And her observations about the conditions of excavation of the day are particularly interesting and somewhat graphic. This slide describes Howard Carter's unfortunate state during the excavations of Queen Hatshepsut's cliff tomb. Over the course of their long period in Egypt, Emma and Theodore's boat, the Dahabiya Bedouin, became the central hub for discussion and planning each season for most of the significant Egyptologists and archaeologists working in Egypt. A few of them are pictured here. Most of these encounters are documented by Emma in her diary. Davis's finds include thousands of artifacts now displayed at the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Harvard Semitic Museum, and especially the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art in New York. This is a copy of 2 pages of Davis's will, listing the items he intended to bequeath to the Met. And I've highlighted what Davis considered to be the gem of his collection, here named the canopic jar of Queen Tea. And he kept this piece prominently displayed on his desk at the Reef in So the process of digging into the contents of the diary and researching all the individuals, the events and the places that Emma mentions inevitably prompted additional visits to archives in the US and the UK to photograph related historical material. And so our archive, our digitized archive that I essentially keep on a hard drive and on my computer has grown exponentially. The collection has evolved to comprise the unpublished writings of some of the hidden figures of Egyptology, who are often, but not always, women. So they're the wives, the secretaries, the administrators, or in Emma's case, the mistress of archaeologists and Egyptologists. And their writings provide unique perspectives on digs in Egypt at the time. An example of this is the unpublished handwritten archive of Helen Winlock, who was the wife of the Metropolitan Museum's director of the Egyptian expedition. Her letters home to her family in Massachusetts describe day-to-day life in Egypt in considerable detail, as well as her husband's digs on the West Bank in Luxor. She also gives an eyewitness account of the process of constructing and furnishing the Metropolitan Museum's dig house in Luxor, which is still used by archaeological teams today, and in fact still has some of the furniture which she chose at the turn of the century. We also have the diaries and letters of the artist Joe Lyndon Smith, who worked for Theodore Davis in the 1904 to 1906 period. He was the artist who recorded many of Davis's finds, and he was present during the opening of KV55 in particular. And his work is a delight to dig through because his handwriting is very legible, and also he peppers it with these wonderful doodles which really bring it to life. I recently photographed the diaries of an Oregon draftsman named Lindsley Foote Hall, who again was working in the Valley of the Kings at the turn of the century. And he was a member of the team when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, and yet his contribution has been largely forgotten. And then finally, I've been gathering up some other unpublished archival material in the form of archaeologists' notes, written by some of the Egyptologists who excavated for Theodore Davis. So here we have Howard Carter again. And you can see that this material might present some unique encoding challenges, not least the hieroglyphs. So I've given you a sense of the scope and nature of the type of material that we're working with. So I'll talk a bit about the process we follow to make these sources machine readable in such a way that we can programmatically extract the data that I'm interested in researching further. So Emma's diaries consist of 19 volumes of text. They would originally have been handwritten, but the original sources unfortunately are now lost, and I have thoughts about why this is the case. What remains are 3 out of 4 typewritten copies, which were made in 1916 at the behest of the then director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There are 2 bound copies still at the Met, and one is at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And they're otherwise inaccessible unless you physically visit either institution. So our work will be the first time that the diary is made more widely available. And if you can see, interestingly, this is the APS version, and it was actually owned by Herbert Winlock. That's his signature up on it. So there are lots of kind of connections between the various people that we've been researching. So here is one of our transcribed primary source diaries. We begin by transcribing into a plain text document. And until now, we've been hand coding the documents in TEI XML. TEI, as you probably all know, is the Text Encoding Initiative. The focus is on capturing basic structural elements in the diaries, as well as particular aspects of the content which we want to investigate further. So in this case, we've marked up people's names, place names, archaeological sites, boats, hotels, etc. I wrote an XSLT script which generates an alphabetized list of all the entities we've marked up in the diaries. And these results form the basis of our ongoing biographical and historical research. The list of entities is a really good starting point, since it enables us to use targeted keyword searches in other resources, which gives us relevant information and also a range of spelling variants to work from. As we built up our research material, we had to decide on a content management system for the project. And some of my considerations for this included choosing an open source option with an active community of users and developers, also good support documentation and active discussion forums as well. We also wanted an out-of-the-box solution so that we didn't have to do too much development, while still offering the possibility of customizing and tweaking as we went along, and as our needs became more apparent. I also wanted a simple yet functional back-end interface, which would allow me to add multiple users and assign them differing levels of access based on their role in the project. And so we decided to use Omeka, which checked all of these boxes. It also integrates Dublin Core metadata for our uploaded items and a range of plugins to facilitate data display and analysis. This is a snapshot of some of our named entities in Omeka. To date, we've created a database of around 800 individuals mentioned in our primary source material. And we generally use the CSV upload plugin for bulk upload of metadata entries. And these include brief biographies for as many of the individuals that we can find, which are then displayed on the project website. And we've called our database the EMApedia. The goal is to use our machine-readable text to generate output which can be read online or on an e-reader or even printed as a physical book. We've experimented with the development of various viewer displays and ended up with 5 different views which are based on different platforms like the Internet Archive Reader. We've used Twitter's Bootstrap framework and also TEI boilerplate as well. This is the output that we're calling the textual view, which we're going to experiment a bit more with this year. As you can see, people's names that we tagged in the encoding process are dynamically linked with our biographical and historical research database. The aim is to give readers contextual information as they look through the documents on our website, with the option to read a more detailed biography by clicking through to the EMApedia. And I'll show you another version of this dynamic linking shortly in the form of a D3 visualization. I've been using the pronoun we when I talk about some of the work that I've completed. And I'd like to go behind the scenes and talk a bit about our undergraduate Digital Humanities internship program that has grown out of my initial very slow one-woman attempts to transcribe and encode the diary back in 2011. So, as luck would have it, I was fortunate enough to meet a faculty member in NELC at the University of Washington, Professor Walter Andrews, who was also working to transcribe and encode a series of Iraqi travel journals from the 19th century. And he had a couple of dedicated undergrads working with him on his project. He suggested that I advertise on the undergraduate research opportunity board, which I did. And I also ended up with a couple of interns. And from there, our group began to grow exponentially. This led us to establishing Newbook Digital Texts at the end of 2011, which is registered with the Library of Congress as a publishing house. The starting point of our work is the preservation of lesser known or understudied texts from the Near East. And we choose material that might otherwise be lost or remain inaccessible. I've mentioned that you can only see Emma's diaries if you physically go to one of the 2 locations that have the typewritten copies. Walter's diaries were kept in a garage in Baghdad. so he ended up having to ship them over here in order to transcribe them and preserve them. And our method for preservation is through digitization using non-proprietary open source technologies. And this process of digital publication has generated a wealth of machine-readable texts. And as academics, it's provided us with the opportunity to dig into our historical research using computational methodologies. We've been able to involve our undergraduate interns in all aspects of this research work, and we feel that this is one of the strengths and unique features of the work that we do. I collaborate with between 5 and 10 student interns each quarter who work on various aspects of the project at any given time, and this might include transcription, encoding, historical research, project management, marketing, or web development. Students receive independent research credits for participation in our project work. Over eight years, we've worked with over 170 University of Washington undergrads and several graduate assistants. Students come from departments across campus. We don't have any prerequisites for joining our group, and we find that the interns that we take on have in common a shared love of history and of literature and a curiosity about how computer technology fits into all of this. We currently have 4 active projects working under the Newbook umbrella, sharing the common publication and education goals that I've talked about. Besides my research, I've mentioned the Svoboda Diary project with the Iraqi travel journals, and these are significant because of the quality of historical detail they record about topics as diverse as weather patterns, medicine, trade, and river travel along the Euphrates. We have the Georgian Digital Texts Collective, which seeks to present Georgian literature and culture to a worldwide audience in dual and trilingual formats. And then the Baki project is our largest project to date, started about 3 years ago. And we have over 30 collaborators in the US, the UK, and in Turkey. And they're all working to identify, catalogue, transcribe and publish the collected works of the Ottoman poet Baki, who is arguably the most famous Ottoman poet of all time. My role in that project has been as DH project manager. As our program has grown, it's moved beyond the initial transcription and encoding. And our research is driven equally by my interests, as well as students' curiosity and the skills that they either bring to the internship or that they want to develop while working with us. So here are a few examples of this. One of my students wrote a C# script to scrape the Metropolitan Museum's website for items bequeathed by Theodore Davis in the will, which I showed you earlier. We generated a CSV file with around 2,000 individual items, and we were able to pull 600 images into my Google Drive account. And I should mention that the Met's images are freely available online, so there was no pirating going on. I hadn't really had a good sense of the sheer scope and range of the items that Davis and Emma collected until I looked through these images, and it begged the question, well, what to do with all this information? So we've decided to use the Met data to see if we can identify the provenance and history of some of this material based on entries in Emma's diary and the other primary source material that we've collected. We've completed work on all the will entries now, and we're beginning to move that onto our project website. We've also been developing digital maps to visualize the base texts. This example is built using Neatline, which, as you know, is an Omeka plugin. And I developed this during a month-long DH fellowship at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia a few years ago. It shows excavations in the Valley of the Kings between 1902 and 1913 on a contemporary 1909 base map. And clicking on each map point leads to a repository of information about each tomb, including a database of archaeological material, contemporary correspondence, diary entries, and the archaeologist's notes. And all of that is in a linked Omeka exhibit. We've also built a couple of story maps focusing on teasing out some of Emma's historical narrative in a visual and interactive way. And you saw a screenshot of one of those a couple of slides ago, the Donna Laura Mingetti Leonardo, which is another interesting story. And we found that work of this nature, so non-traditional publication and visualization, helps bring history alive for our audience, and our website visitors are able to engage actively with our research material. One thing I haven't mentioned so far about Emma Andrews is that we haven't managed to find a photograph of her yet. I'm confident that we will at some point. Students are invariably intrigued by how she might have looked, and so they came up with the idea of using a TEI trait tag to try and capture physical descriptions of her in contemporary textual material and in family photographs that I've collected. The goal was to create a 2D and perhaps a 3D visualization of how she may have looked, and this is an artist's rendering in 2D based on the students' work, which they presented at the Undergraduate Research Symposium at the UW a couple of years ago. And I'm still hoping that some students will be inspired to work on a 3D version of the same project. Over the years, I found that I learn as much from my students as I hope they learn from me. I've also learned about the process of digital project management as we've built our project from the ground up, and sometimes, usually the best learning is obviously by making mistakes and having to go back and fix things. Some of the main challenges that we face include project sustainability. And the solution to this, aside from the thorny topic of consistent funding, boils down to comprehensive project documentation to include processes, work logs, and instruction manuals. The biggest issue we face is that students inevitably and somewhat inconveniently graduate. And unless they fully document what they've done, what they've built, when we go back, when things break and we have to go back and try and fix them, we have to essentially recreate everything again. And so in terms of project management, we use Basecamp to track our transcription work. And I add the original images, instructions, and then students upload their plain text documents to the platform when they've finished. We use the free educational version, and it's been great for creating quarterly schedules, tracking progress, and also communicating with the team at large. We use GitHub to track our encoding work. So we have the master copy of the transcription, which lives in our organization's repository. And then interns fork that to begin their encoding work. Once they've finished encoding, they submit a pull request, and I check all their work before merging back with the master copy. And it means that we always have one clean copy of our text, and that nobody but me touches the masters. And again, we learnt this the hard way. We started off by using Google Docs, and of course we found that people overwrote other people's work, deleted things, etc. So GitHub has worked very well for version control. Another constant issue that we've been addressing is quality control, or how to ensure consistent transcription and encoding standards. It's very easy to miss off an angle bracket, for example, as students go through encoding. And we have varying groups of students each year with different skill levels, etc. One of the biggest transcription challenges with the handwritten material is that most of my students were not taught how to write cursive, let alone how to read it. So they really do struggle. It's very slow work transcribing these handwritten documents, and also the vocabulary is very different as well, late 19th century. So that's been another challenge. Fortunately, I was invited to teach a seminar class in computational linguistics about 18 months ago, which gave me the opportunity to bring my questions about the process of managing and automating the workflow and markup processes for a text-based DH project to a very talented group of graduate students. And you can see some of my questions that I brought to the table listed out here. I essentially took my historical data sets to them along with our XML-TEI schema, and I invited the students to put what they'd learned in their classes into practice. This is one example from earlier, one of Lindsley Hall's diary pages, which has been very challenging for students to read and very slow to transcribe. So students in the seminar experimented with this challenging handwriting. They explored binarization of images using computer vision from Microsoft Azure. There were a number of challenges in generating decent output that wasn't very error-ridden. But along the way, one thing we did learn that was that the iPhone images that I was taking as I visited in archives were as good, if not better, than some of the images that historical societies sent to me. So that was a good thing to learn. And our work with the Hall diary ultimately proved somewhat frustrating, probably because one of his handwritten lines of text tends to run into the line below it, and the algorithm struggled to make sense of it all. It was one of the frustrations of the quarter system. 10 weeks is never enough time to really dig into a problem. And you can see one of the students' comments about it on this slide. Another group of students built this OCR recognition and cleanup interface. You can see that potential errors in OCR text are highlighted in red here on the left for the user to go in manually check and edit as necessary. And then another group built an end-to-end system designed to recognize named entities in the text, including the person, place name, and organization, which I mentioned I'm very interested in researching further. Spelling variants are often a challenge in historical documents, and in this case, the same place name, Aswan, has been spelled in multiple ways in the same document. In other cases, the 19th century name is no longer used and bears no relation to its modern variant. So this student team used Wikidata to pull in place name spelling variants, and they also added a couple of fields for users to add variants as necessary. And then finally, this group worked on a system for automating spelling correction of OCR output using both statistical and rule-based models for their corrections. The student work and the tools that they built are all available in GitHub. And to reinforce the importance of complete documentation, the students were graded on developing and including both technical documentation for potential future development, but also user-friendly documentation for people like me who weren't quite as tech-savvy as they were. One of the students in the class wanted to continue her work on historical documents and asked me to act as one of her computational linguistics master's thesis supervisors, which I did last year. And she created over the course of the year this historical markup tool, which takes our plain text documents and outputs valid TEI text with a TEI header and the body text with named entities recognized and automatically marked up. The tool is live on our website now, and we plan to use it extensively this year for our encoding work. And again, we're hoping it will ease some of the difficulties of having many hands working on encoding tasks. Pulling all of this together, the goal of this work is to develop a who, was, where, when database and visualization for this period in early Egyptology, which I hope other Egyptologists will contribute to. We've begun a proof of concept D3 visualization, which pulls in Dublin Core biographical entries from our Omeka platform, along with the GitHub encoded material. And this was actually built by a group of 4 students, capstone students in computer science, doing a data visualization workshop, and they built it in just 4 weeks, which I find remarkable. And so one of my research goals for this coming year is to continue to work with groups of capstone students from both informatics and human-centered design and engineering to further develop this prototype's functionality and the range of data that it draws into the visualization. I'll finish up by backtracking a little bit to speak about teaching digital humanities. A natural progression from the Newbook internship work was the development of an introductory course for undergraduate and graduate students in DH. We were funded for me to develop and teach 3 iterations of the class in the 2015 to 2016 school year. And I've taught it a total of 5 times now. The data sets I chose for my initial classes were Egyptological in nature, but as my confidence grew, I expanded the data sets to offer students a range of material to choose from. They've worked with New York Public Library, menu data, and also a range of historical newspapers. I'll be talking about the fall 2018 class briefly, and then some of the lessons that I have learned from my early teaching efforts. So the goals and outcomes of the class were threefold and have their origins in what I've learned and observed in the Newbook student internship program. So I wanted to foster core computing competencies for humanities and social science students, as well as promoting a team working environment that's based on interdisciplinarity and collaboration. And finally, I wanted to highlight the value of using digital tools to investigate humanities data with consideration for best practices for building and curating a DH project. The initial classes were based in my home department of Near Eastern languages and civilizations, and it proved challenging to promote and fill the class since students generally don't go looking for a DH course in a NELC department. I had to make a lot of posters, go into various lectures, pitch the class, etc., really sell it. But for the latest fall class last year, I was able to have the course listed through the informatics department, which is a very popular major, more of a natural home for a DH class, and it filled within a day of being open for registration with no further effort on my part. We work on the quarter system at the University of Washington, as I've mentioned, and the DH classes met twice a week for 3 3/4 hours of in-person time. And so in order to maximize the amount of time available for hands-on work with both myself and my TA present in class, I decided to flip the classroom with the expectation that students carried out preparation before the class period by watching introductory videos that I recorded, as well as various readings. We had an online discussion board as well. And then they came to class ready to put some of the theories that they'd learned about into practice. The student groups were very diverse in terms of backgrounds, skills, experience, so I had them complete a pre-class survey so that I could place them in well-balanced teams, which would enable them to interact and learn from each other, as well as building invaluable social skills. The traditional university classroom, which often presupposes a lecture-based, somewhat passive learning experience, wouldn't have been suitable for the type of hands-on group work characteristic of digital humanities. But fortunately, the University of Washington has a number of active learning classrooms with practical features like easily movable furniture to create seating hubs for the teams, a larger monitor screen at each table. We had writable wall surfaces for planning and brainstorming activities, and essentially multiple appropriately situated electrical outputs for student laptops. This setup enabled me to get more one-to-one interaction with students and to give frequent and immediate feedback during team activities, and also to troubleshoot effectively in class. And I found that I was able to give students with different learning styles a more personalized experience. Moving between teams each class enabled me to really get to know the dynamics of each group, as well as students' interests, concerns, etc. So it became a very personalized experience. As I have mentioned, I consider myself something of a subject matter expert first and a digital humanist second. It's often the case that humanities faculty are resistant to the notion of introducing a practical or technical element into their classroom, not least because teaching tech to a group of students versus more traditional humanities topics can present challenges to the subject matter expert. And so, recognizing this, I saw the intro class as an opportunity to collaborate with my colleagues both in the library and in other departments to offer students a comprehensive and well-rounded syllabus. So, for instance, we had a lecturer in library and information science come in to talk to the group about copyright and about sourcing open source material. We had the metadata librarian come in to talk about Dublin Core metadata and the importance of establishing consistent and complete standards and records as a matter of project sustainability. And then finally, we had a faculty member from human-centered design and engineering come in to talk about effective project planning and design. And I also had the opportunity to collaborate with a commercial vendor to leverage their content and digital tools in a classroom setting. This is a syllabus which was quite broad in scope. And over the course of the quarter, students learned best practices for planning their projects, for creating and curating a data set. They used digital tools to analyze the material that they'd collected before finally building a digital exhibit to display the results of their work. We again used Omeka for display purposes and a range of open source tools for the process of collaborative data set creation, curation, and analysis. So this rubric summarizes what I was looking for in each project. Students needed to demonstrate that they had planned their projects effectively, including developing a data management plan for the hypothetical long-term preservation of their work, as well as project documentation, which included a project charter and a project one-pager, which set out how the team agreed to work with each other, as well as how they intended to present their work to the outside world. Their main assignment each week was to keep a detailed work log of everything that they'd done, documenting both their successes and their failures, because of course the failures are the greatest learning opportunity. And they always got full credit for things that didn't work, provided they had documented the process completely. And then finally, they were expected to upload digital objects, including images, visualizations, maps, etc., which were to be described with standardized and consistent Dublin Core metadata. So I'll finish by showing you this slide, which is a demographic breakdown of the students in last fall's intro class. It was my largest class to date. It had 35 students on the roster. As you can see, the demographics were very varied, with representatives from humanities, social sciences and informatics backgrounds. Students had varying levels of technical competency. 90% of the group had no experience of DH work. They told me they were drawn to the class because they had already developed, they wanted to apply the tech skills that they'd already developed to a humanities data set, or simply because they were curious about what DH actually was. And this curiosity and spirit of engaged learning is something that I have observed over the last decade in my interaction with all students who have worked with me. And of course, it's one of the goals of a university education, so it's been wonderful to play some small part in that. Thank you very much. So we've got plenty of time for questions and discussions. I guess it's good that everyone is.
I have a question.
Overall. Yeah.
In your opening survey to the students, did you do any kind of examination of their learning styles?
Yes, I did. I asked them essentially how they like to learn, whether it was having somebody standing up delivering the information, whether they preferred, visual things like lectures, if they like to read, etc. Often it was a combination of everything, and I did try to provide that in the class. I found that very few students in the class were actually passive learners in terms of sitting there taking notes. And I found also, I know yesterday we touched on perhaps some students feeling anxious about making verbal contributions in class, and I found that breaking the class into smaller teams of, say, 5 students broke down those barriers and enabled a more kind of dynamic interaction between the smaller groups. And then we came together at the end for team discussions, sort of inter-team discussions. So yes, I asked about their learning styles, their experience, their interests, that sort of thing. And I tried to map those to the various roles that I assigned within the group project. So we had a project manager, a content specialist, a visualization specialist, a mapping specialist, and then a metadata specialist. And each of those was responsible for that particular aspect of the project. Yes?
Yes, you had mentioned that not all of the typewritten versions of the diaries were available, that you had some thoughts as to why not. If you don't mind, could you share some of those thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's probably the same reason that we've not been able to find any photographs of Emma. I think after Theodore and Emma's deaths in 1915 and 1922 respectively, things became very contentious in the family. Theodore's will was contested. It actually took 10 years and ended up at the Supreme Court. And I suspect that Emma's family destroyed a lot of her material. I have found some handwritten letters by her in the Griffith Institute in Oxford, and I visited Columbus, Ohio 6 or 7 years ago. And I got in touch with a member of a very distant relative. So he was, the great-great-grandson of one of Emma's cousins. And it happened that he had a box of letters in his attic, which the family had had the house for many generations, and he met me in a parking lot in Starbucks in Columbus and handed the box over to me for the day, and I took it to the library and dug through it. And actually found a letter written by Emma to her cousin in there, which I was thrilled about. And I gave the box back to him, and then about a month later he emailed me and he said, you know, I think that letter belongs with you. And so he FedExed it to me, and I'm now the proud owner of one of Emma's letters. But I think that's the reason that we've struggled to find anything her diaries and what have you, which is a real loss. But having said that, her handwriting is appalling. So the thought of having to work through 19 volumes, that would have been very challenging. Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about who's the audience for this project, like how you imagine it being used in the future.
Yeah, so I went to a conference a couple of years ago, the Astini conference, which is the association for travellers in the Near East, essentially. And many of the people presenting had collected similar material to the type of stuff I've been showing you. And so there were discussions at the conference about generating a big database, the who, was, where, when database. So that I think will be the primary academic audience, people researching similar time and material to me. But I would say that Egyptology remains endlessly fascinating to the world at large, and looking at our web statistics, visitors come from all over the world. And then we also have distant relatives of Emma's as well. A few people have contacted me via our Facebook page and offered, one of them had one of Emma's teapots, which is engraved with EBA. I mentioned the Donna Laura Ming Leonardo. So on the way back from Egypt every year, the couple would stop in Italy and purchase Renaissance artwork. They were, in fact, Theodore Davis was in competition with Isabella Stewart Gardner for the best material, and they both worked with Bernard Berenson to identify these artworks for purchase. And Theodore found what he thought was a lost Leonardo da Vinci, which was owned by a woman called Donna Laura Mingatti, and he purchased it and took it out of the country under a cloak of secrecy. As soon as he got it back to the reef, he proclaimed it to the world. There was great crowing and exultation. But then its authenticity began to be questioned. And it gradually faded from the limelight, and the last mention of it is in a New York apartment in the 1950s, and then it vanishes from the record. And so the woman who had the teapot was married to the son of one of the nieces, and I happened to mention the artwork, etc. And I mentioned the Leonardo Mingatti, and she said, "Oh yeah, it's hanging in our hallway." So she sent me a photograph of this remarkable piece of artwork, and a Swiss scholar has published kind of extensively on this piece, and I was able to say, would you like to see a photograph of it? And so I was able to email him a photo of Laura Mingatti. So those are the little kind of nuggets. It's an unexpected audience. You never know. Yes?
How successful or effective has the OCR cleanup part of it been?
Variable, to be honest. Initially, I had hoped that I could use Abby Fine Reader to process Emma's typewritten diaries. We did that, and the output was terrible. And if you look at pages of the diaries, you can see the page behind kind of bleeding through. And when I went to the American Philosophical Society to look at the diary, I found that the pages were really thin, and whoever had scanned it should have put a blank piece of paper between the pages, which would have easily solved that problem. The work that the computational linguistics students was doing was very promising. Most of the handwritten engines are trained on material from like the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and often it doesn't correlate well with material from the late 19th, early 20th century. So that was one issue there. But there's a fantastic project called Transcribus, whereby you can upload your corpora of handwritten documents and train the model within Transcribus if you have sufficient documents, and that is very promising for future work. So I'd say, it's variable, but we do have some strategies now, as I showed you, for cleaning up the output, which have been very helpful. Yes.
Yeah. This wasn't in your presentation, but I'm curious if you have an opinion about it. The Met site that you scraped, I use in my classes. I teach a world civilization class, and they're like freshmen and sophomore. It's a survey class, but I make them go to the Met and a couple other sites that have like very good photos of objects with context and things like this, and maybe some essays about those objects. And I always feel conflicted about whether I should have them also read things about how back in the 19th century those objects were required in the ethical, situations surrounding them. And I'm wondering if you do that with your students.
Yeah, it's certainly a conversation they have. I mean, they read it in the diaries, so they know how these objects were acquired and how little involved often Egyptian nationals were in having a voice in where their history ended up. But the fact is, it happened, and it's important, I think, to have those conversations to make them apparent and visible. That's one of the reasons why we've been interested in working on the provenance issues for some of these items that have no provenance attached to them, because often you see them and there's no context. So.
You say you started with the first students in 2011 on this. Have you kept up and seen how they've used these sorts of skills after?
Yes. Yes, I have. A few of them have gone on to graduate study in international relations, history, etc. One of my current students, Calvin, is something of a handwriting rock star, and he intends to go on to a PhD program in history. And getting to know the students so well, we're able to write very strong recommendation letters for them as they're applying to jobs and programs. And some of the things we highlight are the combination of both the so-called traditional humanities skills, writing, speaking clearly, that sort of thing, but also the tech skills that are layered onto that, project management, collaborative. So we feel that the package that they're able to present to both the academic and working world is a very strong one, and often they have demonstrable projects to show, like the story maps that they've worked on, the other data visualizations that they've created. So they can weave a narrative around the work that they've been doing with us, which is always compelling, I think. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, well, thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Well, we have some time for the workshop. It's going to be in the room up here, the Smith, but feel free to get